Your stories don't define you, but how you share them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and Chief Storymaker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, and to connect. But what we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're being perceived by the people you're interacting with. When you figure out which stories to share, difficult bosses and coworkers, successes, failures, the next step is to develop how you share them. When I'm working with clients on communication techniques, I remind them to listen for understanding and not to respond. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen to consider your related stories and to consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. Visit elkinsconsulting.com to learn how I can help you and your team uncover relevant personal stories to improve your team's communication and sales. Today's podcast features my dear friend, Dr. Melissa Hughes. Melissa is a speaker and author of the book Happy Hour with Einstein, and you'll read more about her on her website and connect with her on LinkedIn. The links to both will be in the blog post associated with this episode. Welcome, Melissa. Thanks so much for joining me on today's podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm one of your biggest fans. I love your podcast.
Thank you. Well, they're really fun. I really enjoy them. And sometimes I get off of one of these calls and I just feel so full of insights and ideas, and I just want to process for a while. And I have no doubt that today's podcast will leave me with a lot to think about. But before we get started, I want to ask you a question that I always ask my guests. I'd love to hear a story or something to describe something about yourself that people generally don't know. Something that I wouldn't find on your resume or on your website or anywhere on LinkedIn.
I think one thing that people don't know about me is that I am an extroverted introvert.
Okay.
So I am, if you meet me, and I can talk to pretty much any stranger on the planet, and I get excited. I love a good conversation as much as the next guy, but I have found about myself that I really am an extroverted introvert, because at heart I am very introverted. I tend to process things. I get really introspective, and it's a blessing and a curse. It can be a really great thing to be introspective and to process things in your head, but you can't stay there. What I've found is that connecting with other people, having real rich conversations and dialogues with other folks and letting other people poke your brain is just as important as poking your own. So
poking your brain, like pushing buttons.
Right? Absolutely. Well, and so this was completely unplanned, but that is why the No Longer Virtual group of folks and that conference was so meaningful to me, because you read things online, you have that digital conversation, and that's kind of where it stops most of the time. And then what you were able to do is extend that virtual conversation into the real world. And that is that meaningful connection piece that we so often miss in the social world, in the digital world, and we get it in the real world. So
well, that's a great point. And it's so funny that you say that, because I've kind of come to a very similar conclusion about myself. And many years ago, I heard a speaker, Jerry May Rowley, and she is the daughter of a saddle maker in Montana. And she said, it's not about whether you're outgoing, it's about how you recharge. That's the difference about the introvert versus extrovert.
Yeah.
And I realized that when I've been out, and people are surprised to hear that I'm generally kind of a shy person. I know it's kind of shocking sometimes for people to hear that. But what I realized is that I do need alone time to recharge. And that's why some of my favorite activities are outside hiking by myself. And so I really get what you're saying, because I get very lonely if I can't transition those deep, insightful, introspective conversations in my head and kind of transition them into a conversation with somebody externally to help walk me through it.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes, but you're right. There's a major danger to that because you can end up spending way too much time in there, and people are surprised when they're lonely because they have all this online activity and they think that that's fulfilling that need, but it's really not.
Absolutely. And
So,
loneliness has actually become the fourth pillar or social connectedness has become the fourth pillar of well-being, because loneliness is such a chronic problem.
and isn't that crazy?
Yeah, with the rise, and it coincides with the rise of the social media world. So.
And it doesn't surprise me at all. And actually, a few of my conversations on this podcast have been about that aspect of loneliness. The fact that you have all these friends on Facebook and LinkedIn and whatever, but if you're not connecting face to face, you're actually missing a huge part of that connectedness.
Absolutely.
Well, okay. And on that note, let's move into the meat of our conversation. You probably remember a few weeks ago, we started a conversation about expectation and resentment. And there's a song that you added into your video that you did as a result of our conversation, which is "The Sun is Shining Down" by J.J. Grey and Mofo. And the lyrics that were, "It's the little things, not expectations, that make life worth living for." And I sang that part to you because it was very meaningful to me at that moment when I'm going through some things with my older son. And what was interesting was that you said that this seems to be a theme in your head as well. And part of your video, which was so excellent, I loved it, was about our brains and expectations. And right at that same time, I had watched a video by Aaron Orndorff on LinkedIn that his quote just has stuck with me. And it was, "Expectations are fuel for resentment." And I realized we're really talking about two different aspects of expectations in a really big way. So I'd love it if you could share one story about expectations that fit one or the other aspects of that topic.
Well, I have to actually share two little stories, and I'll connect the dots for you because I think it's really important. Because after, as so many of my conversations with you go, I'm left I'm thinking about it a little long after the conversation's over. But when my roots are in education, and I was a classroom teacher, and as a classroom teacher, I know I have to have high expectations for my kids. Studies show that the expectations that teachers have for students have a significant impact on their performance. If we have high expectations for kids, they will perform better. If we have low expectations for kids, they will perform lower. Same with kids going to college. Like, if we expect them to go off and go to college, they have a much greater likelihood of attending college and actually finishing. So, in that respect, that whole expectations or premeditated resentments doesn't apply, right? So you think, okay, well, so I had to break, after our conversation, I kind of had to break expectations down into 4 buckets. And I think that expectations fall into those that we have for ourselves, those that we have of ourselves, those that we have for others, and those that we have of others. So those 2 little words, of and for, actually, differentiate whether expectations are fuel for resentment or expectations are the secret to success, I think. So, for example, if the expectations that we have of ourselves, like we expect ourselves to have a good moral compass, to do the right things, to have compassion for other people. But for ourselves, we often expect a rewarding career, a bigger raise, a better car, payoffs for our hard work. We expect to be appreciated for the things that we contribute to our workplace. We want a healthy, happy family, right? But the same applies to others. So we have expectations of them and we have expectations for them. For my students, I have expectations for them to do really well. But I also have expectations of them. I expect them not to cheat. I expect them, to do their homework, to do their very best. And I think what really kind of it was ingrained in my brain after our conversation was because I have been dealing with some unmet expectations in my life as well. And I have a family member who, I lent money to, and he was supposed to pay me back, and he didn't pay me back. And there were clear expectations that it was a loan. And for everyone listening to the podcast that says, you don't mix money with family, I've already heard that story. I get it, right? I understand. But
you knew.
but the expectations of myself is that I'm going to do the right thing and help someone in need. And my expectation of him is that he's going to do the right thing and pay me back. And instead, he went on vacation. And
oh, ouch.
So what I learned, though, as I started to drill into this, because you know me, Sarah, and I am all about what's happening in my brain. Like, what is the neuroscience behind it? Because I am a complete and total geek that way. And what I learned is that there are some things happening up there that the more I care about the person, the more the more the disappointment hurts, the more the unmet expectation hurts. And that has everything to do with our limbic system. And so to those folks who say, you just have to learn how to manage your expectations. And there were people in my family that told me that. And I say, that's not how my brain works. That's not how the brain works. And there is a whole bunch of neuroscience happening in the background, which, it's all in the blog, but it's a real thing. And now I can step back and go, okay, I'm not hurt by him. I'm hurt because I had expectations of him that were intensified because I love him, right? So the people that you care about the most are the people that hurt you the most.
Of course.
Expectations you have met. And so just being able to connect those dots made it easier for me to put it in a place where it makes sense in my brain. I'm still disappointed that he didn't do the right thing. But I know it's more what's happening in my brain and less that he's malintended or, was doing something purposefully to hurt me. I know that's not the case,
Right. And part of that is that optimism, even though you know that he's not particularly responsible or reliable. So in your head, you knew that when you loaned him this money, but your limbic system said, be an optimist. You love him. Maybe this time it will be different.
Absolutely. And there is a bias. There is the optimism bias that says, because he has burned me in the past, I know this time he's going to do the right thing. Because I so want him to. I want him to make up for those other times that he didn't do the right thing. And that's the optimism bias at work. And that has nothing to do with him. That has everything to do with what's going on in my head. And so for me, knowledge is power. And so just understanding that is going on in my head, it makes it easier. I can say, this is why. I get it. This is why.
Right?
So the expectation is still unmet, but it doesn't hurt as much when I understand there's a subconscious bias going on in my head that twists it. And the more he's burned me in the past, the more I want him to do the right thing next time. And so there is there's an unconscious bias that says, I'm likely going to do this again. The next time he needs something, I'm going to go back and I'm going to do it again, knowing what I know now, past behavior predicts future behavior, but I'm going to do it because I want him to do the right thing, because we want people to reciprocate, right?
And wasn't it P.T. Barnum, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. So this has been going on for, hundreds of years, but because our human brain hasn't changed in that way, we will continue to be fooled. Absolutely. Particularly by people we care about or we like.
Absolutely. I think the one other thing that I can talk the brain with you all day long, Sarah, so you're going to have to cut me off. But the other thing I want to point out is dopamine, because dopamine plays a big part in that disappointment. And when I say that, people go, wait, dopamine's the reward and pleasure chemical. which is true. And when we anticipate a reward or something pleasurable, our brain releases a big dose of dopamine, which is a good thing. And when that reward or pleasure is unexpected, we get an even bigger dose of dopamine. And that's why getting random flowers on Tuesday makes such a bigger splash in your brain. It feels so much better than birthdays or flowers on Valentine's Day, because we expect flowers on Valentine's Day. But then, some of us. But the opposite is also true. The opposite is, unmet expectations have an equally significant impact on our brain chemistry, but in the negative way. So when we expect a reward and we don't get it, then our dopamine levels drop significantly. And that drop in dopamine actually generates a fear-threat response in the limbic system. And it shuts down like all the happy places in our brain. And it says, danger.
Cortisol.
Cortisol. Take care of this fear. Take care of this threat. And the unexpected, unmet, those unmet expectations that are a surprise, the same rule applies. That, when we're surprised by that, it's like when you get a positive note from your boss about something that you've done really well, it means so much more than getting that 3% raise that you've anticipated, for the last 6 months. The raise is coming, it's coming at the end of the year, and you're glad about that, and money's great, but that note from your boss that you didn't anticipate means so much more. And the converse is true. It's why, there have been rumors in your office of downsizing for 6 months, and you've been worrying about whether it's going to be you, and then you finally get the news it's going to be you. Well, of course you're disappointed. Of course that's bad news. But that same bad news is going to hurt so much more if you walk in on Monday morning and you get the can. So,
right.
It's the exact same news. It's just the brain processes it so much differently.
That makes sense. I'm reminded of when our boys were really little, and I remember one time, I think we were at the grocery store, and my older son might have asked for something, some sugar cereal that we don't get. We were a Cheerios family, but I think he wanted like Frosted Flakes or something, and I said no, and I said, let's go pick something else out, and he started to cry. He was really sad about it. And a total stranger was walking by me, and she said, how old is he? I said, 3. And she said, oh, life is full of disappointments when you're 3. And it kind of took me off guard because I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but it's absolutely true that with younger kids, they expect something to be a yes. And when it's not, it's kind of devastating to them. And it didn't work out the way that they had expected. And everything, the big part about it is that everything is a big deal at that age.
Yeah.
Every little interaction is kind of a big deal between about 3 and 10 years old. And shortly after that, I had this conversation with my younger sister who didn't have kids yet. And I said, isn't that true that when you're a little kid, life is full of disappointments, not because people say no all the time, but because you have so much invested in getting this chocolate or getting that sugar cereal. So it becomes a much bigger deal. And when somebody says no, it's a bigger drop.
Yeah, absolutely.
And she said, oh yeah, that's why I stopped having expectations. And I said, what? And she said, well, from the time I was little until I was an adult, people never followed through. And so I would be full of these expectations and I'd always be disappointed. And it just was heartbreaking. So as a young adult, I just decided I'm just not going to have expectations anymore. That way I'll be pleasantly surprised when something works out. And I remember thinking that that's kind of a sad way to go through life. But at the same time, I kind of understood that. But what it said to me was that we do have to kind of manage our expectations for what others can grant us. Like when I hear somebody say, I just wanted closure. I wanted to hear him say he was sorry. And I'm always struck by that, because you can't get closure externally.
Right.
That person may never say they're sorry. So how do you make that work for yourself so that you can somehow change the way that your brain adjusts or adapts to that disappointment?
Yeah, it's funny, and I'm going to share another. I can pretty much pull in any conversation, I can pull a neurotransmitter into the conversation. So I'm going to do that again here. And
Good.
that I don't have I can't have expectations because so many people have disappointed me. And so I do volunteer work. I'm a guardian ad litem and for foster kids, and I'm working with a particular young lady right now who's 17 years old, and she's largely been disappointed by pretty much every important person in her life since she's been on the planet. And so she's 17, and I'm trying to encourage her to look ahead and what's next, what's after graduation, and she's really kind of at that place where she's shut down expectations of herself because she's been surrounded by people who have no expectations for her. And one of the things that, it saddens me, because what I know is going on in her brain is when we feel like we belong to a group, when we feel like we belong to a tribe, we've talked about this, right? But when we feel like someone's got our back, when we feel like we can count on someone in this world, that's when oxytocin starts flowing in the brain. And that is like one of the most important chemicals that stimulates all the good parts of the brain. And it when oxytocin is flowing, cortisol is not. So they kind of live on opposite ends of the neurological seesaw. And oxytocin is so important. And it is that combat to loneliness. It is that people who are chronically lonely have such low levels of oxytocin, and it impacts us and it manifests itself in a million physical ways, but it also ties into our expectations of ourselves. So, Michelangelo had a quote about, it's not the danger is not in shooting too high and missing it. The danger is that we'll shoot too low and actually make it. And, so for my 17-year-old foster kid, I worry about her because because she is at that place where no one has had expectations of her, so she doesn't have them of herself. So,
it's heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking. And so, I think the best that we can do is share with her our own, like I can share with her my expectations of her. Like, I expect things of you. I expect good things, great things of you, but you have to expect them of yourself too. And I think the danger lies in when we pass our expectations of ourselves onto other people. And I did that with my family member. Like, I would expect of myself, if I borrowed money, that I would pay it back immediately, if not sooner, right? And I made that expectation of myself an expectation on him. Mm-hmm. And therein lies the disappointment.
So in terms of oxytocin, when you're sitting, say you're taking this girl on a drive, and you reach over and you just put your hand on her shoulder just to let her know you're there, that helps that, right? That releases oxytocin.
Yeah. So oxytocin is that kind of, it's the connection chemical. We get the biggest surge of oxytocin during breastfeeding. A mother and a child breastfeeding is the biggest surge. And there are actually neural pathways in the brain that are dedicated toward the human bond with another person. But the second biggest surge we get is during sex. But we can also get it, just like you say, by putting just human contact, putting your hand on someone's shoulder, the teacher in the classroom, the teacher that pats a child on the back and says, "That's a great job." That gives you a boost of oxytocin. The other thing is when we see people connecting, when we see other people connecting, we get a boost of oxytocin. It's called emotional contagion. And even if we're not involved in that interaction, but we can, through empathy and through just being able to understand what that feels like, our brain will give us a boost of oxytocin. So it is about who you hang with.
So I wonder if it would make sense in the case of this young girl to actually watch romance movies.
Oh, you know what? I don't know. That's a great question. But my guess would be yes. I mean, my guess would be, anything any stimuli that is out there that we have to bring into our brains to process it, there is a piece of it as we're processing it that we imagine ourselves in that situation. So on the negative end, if a boss walks into the conference room and he's all fired up and he's having a terrible day and he's got, the look of anger or angst on his face, he doesn't even have to say anything, and he's going to pass that cortisol right along to the people sitting in that conference room.
Right.
The flip side of that is true. If he comes in optimistic and happy and, laughing, smiling, whatever, he's going to pass those good chemicals on to the folks sitting in that conference room without saying a word. We don't realize how contagious our emotions are to people around us. And if you think about, just like you're out in public, you hear someone having an argument. There's something that threat fear response is evoked in you. You're not part of the argument, but there is a threat fear response going on in your own brain, and you're generating the cortisol too.
So I have to ask you this. I've always been a little puzzled by this. What's the difference between oxytocin and dopamine?
So oxytocin is the connection chemical. It's when you connect with another person. It's the feeling of belonging. Belonging is one of those basic needs on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Mm-hmm. Belonging is there. So that's that piece that says, I belong to this family, I belong to this community, I belong to this church. I have friends who love me, I have a spouse who loves me, whatever it is. Dopamine is completely reward and pleasure. So dopamine is actually addiction chemical, and dopamine is it's not just reward and pleasure, but it's also it is the pathway to learning. So when you say, you try to foster kids in the classroom, you try to foster their intrinsic motivation for learning, that has everything to do with dopamine. That's that really feels good to know that you've learned something new, that you can do this new thing. That's dopamine at work. But dopamine's also at work when you drink one more beer and that feels good, or when you take one more pill and that feels good, or when you gamble or shop or overeat or whatever it is, that's an overproduction of dopamine. So
right.
The biggest difference is you can't have too much oxytocin, but you can definitely have too much dopamine.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. I was always a little puzzled by that. Now, can dopamine and cortisol be produced at the same time?
They cannot. So
same as oxytocin.
Yeah. So okay. There are a bunch of neurotransmitters, but the big ones, the three good ones are dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. Serotonin is your recognition. Dopamine is reward and pleasure. Serotonin is recognition. So when your boss calls you out in front of the company and says, "Hey, Sarah, great job on that presentation," you get serotonin from that. We also get serotonin. So
you blush too, right?
That's right. But that is that feeling that you have made a contribution, that you're valued, that you're respected. It's kind of that status thing that you measure up to your peers, that you measure up that you're of worth.
Okay.
And oxytocin is the connection and the bonding piece. And those three are all chemicals that when they are released, they actually facilitate activity in the prefrontal cortex, which is right behind your forehead. And that's the part of your brain that is in charge of executive function, impulse control, decision-making, planning. That's the part of the brain where we all hope we hang out all the time. When they're not flowing, then cortisol is. So cortisol is the stress chemical, obviously, but those good chemicals flow upstairs to the thinking brain, and cortisol flows downstairs to the survival brain. And when cortisol is flowing, it's saying, hey, pay attention to this. Something bad is going to happen, and you need to be ready to react. So your physiological changes are happening in your body when cortisol is flowing. Your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases, your muscles may even tense. A million years ago, it was when the lion was coming out to get you. You were in fight, flight, or freeze, right?
And that still happens.
Yeah, right? Our lions just are different these days.
Well, no, there was actually a mountain lion sighting on the mountain behind our house just yesterday.
Oh, I forgot. I'm talking to a Montana girl.
I live in Montana. We still use that cortisol periodically.
So, they kind of do sit on opposite ends of the seesaw. Mm-hmm. And what's important to know is when the cortisol tap is on, it actually pauses all that activity in the prefrontal cortex, because as amazing and complex and just crazy, wicked, efficient as the brain is, it knows that it has to allocate resources. So if the downstairs brain is in charge, your thinking brain, your impulse control, your planning, your organization, your higher order thinking, that's all put on pause, because all of your resources are going downstairs to deal with the threat.
Survival.
You're
in survival.
Yeah.
I find that so fascinating. And from the first time we talked at No Longer Virtual in Atlanta in 2017, and you mentioned that cortisol, when dopamine and oxytocin, serotonin are released, cortisol stops being produced. It may still be flowing in your body, but it can't be produced at the same time. And I thought about an article I read many years ago in National Geographic called Love. And they informally measured longevity of relationships and interviewed people at different lengths of their relationship. So young couples of being together a few months versus a few years. And the most common thing that they found in long-term relationships was affection.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized when I read that, this was probably more than 10 years ago, I read this article, and it totally changed me, because I realized that when anyone around me was feeling stressed, or if I was feeling stressed, and I knew that I needed to stop that stress. I didn't know what it was called at the time, not until I met you in 2017, but I recognized the need to touch. And one of the comments in this article from a woman that had been married for over 50 years, she said, when I'm especially upset with him, I force myself to touch him. And my friend said, so she punches him? I said, no, you know what I mean. She would force herself to put her hand on his arm or his shoulder, or hold his hand, or kiss him on the cheek. It's something she would force herself to touch him in some way. And now I know that what that was doing was stopping the production of cortisol.
Right.
And allowing them to start thinking again and realizing the reality of the issue, whether it was a deal breaker or just a small annoyance that had grown beyond its space. And I started doing that with my children after reading this article, and with my husband. When I was really upset with one of them, I would go over and I'd say, I'm feeling prickly and I need you to hug me right now. And it was amazing how it would just kind of stop the frustration. And then we could start talking again like grown-ups. Or like I could calm myself down and stop trying to argue with my 6-year-old or my 10-year-old, to be able to say, okay, we need to start thinking with the correct part of our brain now. But I didn't know that's what it was at the time.
Yeah, oh my gosh, I love that. That is so smart, because two things are happening. I mean, yes, that just that physical touch is increasing the production of oxytocin, and that's inversely related to the production of cortisol. So your cortisol levels are dropping. The other thing at work there is just kind of that authentic vulnerability. Like, this is how I'm feeling and I need something from you, right? And it's something you can give me. And just being able to, having an argument, or you're just in one of those kind of moods and you say, you know what, I need a hug right now. And honestly, that is the best way to kind of just even get back to base, get back to baseline, right? And start over. It's kind of a really nice reset button, not just for what's happening in your brain, but for what's happening to you emotionally, what's happening to you in your heart, because we confuse those things.
It's funny. That reminds me of, I have to share a quick story. When Bob and I were first dating, now our 21st anniversary was yesterday. And if you had told me 25 years ago that I would be married, much less for 21 years, I would not have believed you. I had decided in my youth that I wasn't going to get married and I would never have kids, because I couldn't keep interest in anything for very long. So when Bob and I had been dating for a couple months, maybe 3 months, which was a long time for me to be in a relationship, we were driving from Washington, D.C. up into Wilmington, Delaware to go see my aunt. And it was on 95, and there was traffic, and it was late on a Friday evening, and I was hungry. And I said to him, gosh, I'm hungry. He said, yeah, me too. And then we passed another exit that had food. And I kind of looked at him, and, we're just driving along. And then I would say, wow, I'm really getting hungry. And he would say, yeah. And then we'd pass another exit. And even there's a Chesapeake exit it's between the north and south of I-95. So you could actually get off and grab something to eat at this big food court and then get back on in minutes. It's really fast. And we passed right by it. And I remember I'm starting to get pretty hangry, because when I'm hungry, you don't want to be around me. I get really grumpy. And I realized I was getting really grumpy, and I was disappointed. My expectation was that when I would say I was hungry, that he would stop and get me something to eat. And so I'm kind of leading back into this whole expectation and resentment thing. I started to get really resentful. Every time we'd pass an exit that had a sign that said that there was a McDonald's or, some food exit, and we'd pass by it, and I'd find this resentment boiling up in me. And I finally stopped myself, and I realized, okay, his language is not the same as yours right now. And I said, hey, at the next exit where you see a McDonald's, can we stop? I just need one of those little teeny hamburgers just to get us to Delaware, because I'm really hungry and I'm getting grumpy. He said, oh yeah, of course. And the very next exit, he pulled off, grabbed me a burger, and himself a burger. I mean, something small. It's not like we were eating a bunch of junk food, but it was just enough to get my needs met.
So simple.
It was so simple. And it was years later that I realized that was kind of us training each other, because even after 20 years, he still can't read my mind, even though it feels like he should be able to. My expectation is, we've been together a long time and you should be able to read my mind. But that's just not the case. And so in order for him to meet my expectations, I have to tell them what they are.
Right. I think we're all influenced by the illusion of optimism as it relates to expectations, because I do believe it's just like, you think, I have this expectation that he should understand he should understand that I am saying, please stop at the next place, even though I haven't been that overt about it. Like, what's wrong with him, right? And that is that influence of the illusion of he knows exactly what I'm saying. So part of it is in that communication barrier, that breakdown in communication. But I think also it is, we do have unrealistic expectations that people just know what we need. Like it happens all the time, right? It happens at work. Like, you know, when change is introduced and, you know, your boss says, I want you to do it this way. Immediately, you know, the instinct is to go, what's wrong with the way I'm doing it now? Like he doesn't like the way I'm doing it now. What's wrong with this way? And it might not have anything to do with the way you're doing it now. It might be completely different. And the new way might be way better. But we get stuck in that, you know, that illusion of optimism in our expectations that it goes off, it takes us down a rabbit hole, and it starts to, you know, infiltrate all of these other recesses of our mind. You know, now it's cutting into my confidence and my self-esteem and what's wrong with me. Now I'm mad at him. And,
Well,
you know.
I think that's part of why I really love what I do, and why I know that I'll always have my work cut out for me being a communication coach. I mean, no matter how good you are, you can always be better. And I learn that every day, that even as a coach, I hear things and go, oh, wait a minute, maybe I wasn't that clear about it. But it's fascinating.
It makes me think of another thing that one of my family members just recently said to me was, you know, I feel like you're yelling at me, and I get so passionate about things. Like I've got this thing in my head, and I so very much want you to understand. I want you to join me in my head. Like, come step into my head for a minute, you know, and and so the passion gets translated as anger or frustration, that why aren't you getting it? Like, why can't you understand what I'm feeling or what I'm thinking or what I know? Or, and then it gets translated in a very different way. And so that my lesson is, bring it down a notch and try to hear myself from the outside, you know, and it's hard to do that. It's hard to step outside your own brain. But the good news is, you know, you try to surround yourself with people who are honest enough to say, it sounds like you're really yelling at me right now. It sounds like you're really frustrated me right now. And, you know, that's not the case. And that's the only time that we can actually make real personal change. We have real personal growth, you know, so that's, maybe some days that's the best we can hope for.
I think that is actually a very worthy goal.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that being the I don't know, lowest hanging fruit in terms of our expectations. And I do expect myself to learn something every day. And sometimes it's not obvious what that was, but given time to process and make sure that I'm having conversations that have the possibility of learning and growth, I don't think that's a horrible thing to reach for. I think that's a terrific thing to reach for.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think that what happens is when we are, you know, when we are processing those negative emotions that come along with unmet expectations, whether they be of someone else or of ourselves, you know, it's really hard to flip that on its head and say, okay, now what's the learning lesson in this, you know, in this situation? And one kind of analogy that I've been using a lot lately, and it is, what I know is when I'm in that place in my brain where those negative emotions are fired up and all the negative chemicals are flowing downstairs and there's not a whole lot going up to my impulse control, I take myself back to when I was a kid. I used to go to the Cleveland Indian State. I'm a huge baseball freak, and we used to go to the Cleveland Municipal Stadium. I grew up in Ohio, and my mom and dad would take us, and, you know, we weren't a family of significant wealth, and so my folks could take the entire family to a doubleheader on Saturday for less than $20 and entertain everyone for an entire day with hot dogs and the works, right? And I used to be amazed by the grass patterns when you sit up in the bleacher seats, and we were in the cheap seats, and you could see the grass patterns, you know, the mowing patterns in the outfield. And I used to think that is the coolest thing. And when I get to drive the lawnmower, I'm going to make patterns like that on my yard. And so when I finally got to ride the riding lawnmower by myself, I tried to do that. And the thing is, you can't see the patterns when you're in the grass. You know, you can't see what's happening in your brain when you're really in the weeds. When all that stuff is flowing, remember, it is shutting down your thinking brain. And so when I get to that place, I think, go to the cheap seats. Go sit in the cheap seats right now. And that means take yourself out of the situation, take a time out, step back, take a breath, reset your brain. And then I can see the patterns in the grass. Then I can see those negative emotions and how they're impacting my behavior and how they're impacting people around me. And that works for me, being able, like, I literally say to myself, go find a seat in the cheap seats, like go to the bleachers right now, so whatever works. But
what a great analogy. That is a great analogy. And you can put that into almost anything.
Yeah.
Go to the cheap seats, because you could do that at a concert, going up so that you can actually see everything on the stage instead of having a very narrow view of what you can see from down on the floor, especially if you're little.
Yeah.
Like, when I'm down on the floor, I'm pretty limited in my viewpoint because there are tall people all around me. That I love
and
that
it applies,
analogy.
it applies to business, it applies to relationships, it applies to our friendships, it applies to everything. I mean, when you're in it and there's that pure, raw, emotional, whatever happening, whether it's a good emotion or a bad emotion, it's hard to see everything. It's hard to step back and see the landscape. Mm-hmm. And it's really only when you see the landscape that you really get a clear picture of what's going on and how you fit in the best way possible.
So there are two strategies here that are coming up in my head for doing that. And one is, you have to be self-reflective or introspective enough to know when you're being driven by that lower level in your brain. You have to be able to recognize that. And if you can't, having somebody that is near you, that loves you, that you trust, that you tell them, I fall into this place and I often can't see that I'm there. So what's our cue? How can you give me a hint that I'm there that won't be distracting or create more anxiety? And I think a lot about people who suffer from anxiety disorder that can't do that. And this is one of their strategies. But another one is, once you know you're in that space, if you are one of those introspective people, or you've reflected enough to know that your impulse control is not there, being able to talk to somebody, again, that you trust, or knowing that your strategy is to walk outside and walk up a mountain, or even watching a TV show that calms you, having a strategy in your head that you know you can rely on, I think is, as I think this through, I know I have those strategies, but they haven't been that intentional. But now I'm thinking about it in terms of being intentional with it. And when our older son was 11, he went through some tough times with controlling his blood sugar level. And he wouldn't know that he had tanked. He would just be throwing a tantrum. And this is like the nicest, kindest, sweetest boy you've ever met. And he would throw this tantrum, unrecognizable kid. And when I finally realized what would happen, I would hand him a granola bar or a banana, and I would say, eat this right now. And he'd say, I don't want to. And he'd try to push it away. And whether it was a spoonful of peanut butter, whatever, protein and sugar, I would basically force him to eat something. And it was after probably about a year of doing this that I felt like he was ready to start to recognize those symptoms himself. So we had this conversation. I said, if you are having trouble coming out of it, I need to be able to give you a cue. What do you think that cue should be? When I feel like you're being hangry, or that something's going on and you're having a hard time getting yourself back under control, what can my cue be that won't make you more angry, that you'll know what it is? And we came up with something silly. I can't remember what it was, but I remember I would say something to him like, land the plane, or something silly that would catch his attention and it would make him smile rather than get angry. So I think even as adults, we need those strategies.
I think you're absolutely right. I think you've hit two really big things that are just dear to me. One is, for me, just having that understanding, like I am the why kid. I need to know why. I need to know what's going on up there. And when I do know, then that's the first step. But sometimes, as we've said, when you're in it yourself, you're not seeing the big picture. Your impulse control is all off for whatever reason, and so that's when it gets harder for you to self-manage. And that's when having those trusted people around you, and setting this strategy ahead of time is huge. Because if let's say our code word is banana dazzle, and all of a sudden I hear banana dazzle, that's going to do two things. First of all, that is going to surprise me. That's going to be like, you stop and you take notice. And that's actually going to kind of stop what's happening in my brain. It's going to bypass,
divert. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so just that in and of itself is a way to kind of put the brakes on, and then you can go, oh, that means I need to do something different in this particular situation.
I need to eat something.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is, and I explore this a little bit in my gratitude journal, in that you plan ahead. Like if you know you're going to have a really, really stressful day, you've got, whatever it is, you've got a big meeting coming up, or, you've got finals, or I don't know what your stress is, but you look ahead to that day and you say, you know what, I'm going to need to breathe through this day a lot. Because when you stop and you just breathe and you just focus on your breath, you kind of reset your brain, it is really a really great way just to say, I can get through this. This isn't going to, it will actually diminish the effects of the stress. And, I know people who plug in breathe, just put a breathe in their calendar, and it might take 60 seconds, right? It might be that 4x4 breathing that we learned at NLV in Atlanta,
in Denver
last year. And maybe it takes 60 seconds, but maybe you plug that into your calendar 3 or 4 times a day. Because when I do that, what I think to myself is, I'm frustrated with whatever I've got going on, or I'm stressed with whatever I've got going on, but I know I got a breathing thing. I'm going to get a ping here in a minute to breathe. And so it kind of like lets you look for that good thing that's going to get you over to the next hump. And it sounds so simple, so silly, but it's so effective. It's just so effective. And what do you have to lose? A couple minutes a day? Like, try it, right?
I think the best of our strategies end up sounding very simple.
Yeah.
And if they're not simple, then they're not going to work. They have to be simple, especially if you're stressed.
Absolutely.
That makes a lot of sense. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground.
This is typically how our conversations go, Sarah.
I know. I love it. I think we're going to have to do another one of these sometime in the next 6 months or so. Maybe before the next No Longer Virtual.
Absolutely. Yes, for sure.
That would be great. Melissa, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. It has, as always, been a pleasure chatting with you. And I'm excited for our listeners to get to hear some of what you have to say about this. And just for our listeners' benefit, remember, you'll be able to click on her website, hire her for your speaking engagement, or just connect with her on LinkedIn, follow her videos. You'll have all those links in the blog post associated with this podcast.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I always look forward to your podcast. So I am actually humbled that you would invite me to be on one. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?